Hey guys, Steve the drummer at YouTube.com coming at you. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I got going on over the next couple of weeks. I started it off yesterday with a Loverboy cover of Working for the Weekend. And what I'm going to do over the next several weeks is I'm going to do my version of a 80s versus 90s drum cover style on my channel. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing an 80s drum cover, and a couple of days later I'm going to follow that with a 90s drum cover. And I'm just going to alternate back and forth like that between the 80s and 90s over the next several weeks. More importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments section. I want to hear what decade do you find to be the most important and the most influential, and what is your favorite decade for music? If you would, please leave that in the comments. Tell me which decade it is, why, what it is that you like about it, what it is that you don't like about it. So I start out talking about the 80s and why the 80s is important to me. So actually at the dawn of the decade in 1980, I was 12 years old, and for the duration of the decade, I was 12 through 22. So the 80s are essentially my teenage years, and that was my coming of age time, my time where I was really kind of discovering music, and music was a really important thing to me. And so that's one reason that the 80s is such an important decade to me. It's just because of the positioning in my life. Additionally, the 80s was kind of a very synthetic decade. It was a time where synth pop really kind of took off. Electronic drums, the keytar was developed as a musical instrument. It was a very, for lack of a better word, maybe artificial or fake sounding decade. And I know those sound like derogatory or negative terms, but I'm actually saying that in a very positive way, because that's like I said, that's something that came along when in my teenage years, when music was a really important thing to me. There were some absolutely great bands during that time. New wave bands like Tears for Fears, Duran Duran, Blondie, the B-52s, some power pop bands like the Police, Pat Benatar, Bryan Adams, Huey Lewis and the News, Tommy Tutone, and then of course hair metal. And I always loved the hair metal. Rat, Motley Crue, Ozzy's solo career kicked off in the 80s. I think that was just a really powerful time for music, and that's probably one of my very favorite decades of all. And the flip side to that is the 90s, and for lack of a better word, and I don't mean to speak out of poor taste here or whatever, but the 90s is essentially the enema that washed away all the fakeness of the 80s. The 90s is kind of the decade where everything got real. Bands typically used non-standard tunings, odd time signatures, and the lyrics were a lot more thought-provoking. We got away from the good times of the 80s of singing about fast cars and girls and having a party, and the lyrics just got a lot deeper. Musical styles like grunge and alternative really took off in the 90s. Bands like Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam. There was a big punk scene with Green Day and Blink-182 and The Offspring, and then also other bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Cake, Counting Crows, Soul Asylum, Sublime, just to name a few. It was just an absolutely awesome decade for music and for great bands. The significance of the 90s for me, if I was 12 to 22 in the 80s, then I was 23 to 32 in the 90s, and so that was the decade that I spent most of my time playing the drums in bars, in cover bands, playing 90s music in the 90s in bars. And so the 80s and 90s, two really, really important decades to me, and I'm gonna be knocking out the covers, 80s versus 90s. Like I said, I'd like to hear from you guys though. What decade do you find to be the most significant to you? What resonates most in your heart? Leave that in the comments. I look forward to talking to you guys about it. And if you haven't checked out the Loverboy video, Working for the Weekend, please do head over and check that out. Once again, thanks. Everybody have a great week. Steve the drummer at YouTube.com, where we're bringing yesterday's music into tomorrow.